Marcus Hayes was not a man who often found himself cornered, but as the flickering light of the warehouse faded and the cold cement pressed into his back, it became clear he had underestimated the depth of this conspiracy. His wound pulsed with each breath, the pain creeping up his side as his mind spun with one undeniable fact. Sarah Jenkins had betrayed him. The sound of her voice still echoed in his mind, a whispered apology that did nothing to soften the blow of the bullet she'd put in him. And David Calloway, his mentor turned puppet master, had stood there grinning, reveling in the destruction of Marcus's belief in loyalty. "You were just a pawn," Calloway had said, his words cold and calculated. "This is much bigger than you ever realized." The world blurred as Marcus slipped in and out of consciousness. His mind wandered, retracing every step of his investigation, the corruption, the lies, the deals made in the back rooms of Brookdale. All led to this moment. He had dug too deep, exposed too much, and now they wanted him out of the picture for good. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the warehouse as Calloway and Sarah faded into the distance, leaving Marcus for dead. But the pulse in his chest and the fire in his gut told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next time Marcus opened his eyes, he wasn't alone. The dull throb in his side had lessened, replaced by the faint scent of antiseptic. He struggled to sit up, his vision still hazy, when a firm hand pushed him back down. "Take it easy," a voice said, smooth but laced with urgency. Marcus blinked, focusing on the face above him. It was Tom McAllister, the ex-CIA operative Sarah had introduced him to weeks ago. McAllister's grizzled face was set in a frown, his sharp eyes assessing Marcus with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky to be alive," McAllister said, stepping back to give Marcus space. The room was small, cluttered with old tactical gear and what looked like files stacked on every surface. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a desk lamp and the faint glow of the city outside the window. How did you find me?" Marcus managed to ask, his voice hoarse. McAllister shrugged. "I've got my ways. More importantly, who the hell did this to you?" Marcus grimaced, the pain flaring up again as he remembered. Calloway. And Sarah. She turned on me. McAllister raised an eyebrow, but didn't look surprised. "I had a feeling about that one. Too close to the action, too quick to get involved. But Calloway? I thought that bastard was dead." "So did I," Marcus muttered, his mind racing. He knew McAllister wasn't here by accident. The man never made a move without knowing all the players on the board. "You're gonna need more than just yourself to get back at these guys," McAllister said, tossing a manila folder onto the floor. "This thing goes deep. Deeper than just Calloway and a few corrupt cops." Marcus reached for the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it open. Inside were photographs, names, and documents, some redacted but still damning. It was a web of connections that stretched beyond Brookdale, involving high-ranking officials, corporate executives, and even government agencies. Calloway had built a network, one that thrived on the chaos and corruption of the city. "They've been using Brookdale as a testing ground," McAllister continued. "A place to control the population, incite racial tensions, and push their own agenda. The police, the politicians, even some of your FBI colleagues, they're all in on it." Marcus's stomach turned as he scanned the documents. This wasn't just about Rourke and his racist vendetta. This was about power, control on a level he hadn't anticipated. "How do I stop this?" Marcus asked, looking down at McAllister. The older man smiled grimly. "You don't, not alone anyway." Brookdale was a city on the edge. The protests that had sparked after Marcus's wrongful arrest were now full-blown riots. Buildings were burning, and the police force was stretched thin. The people had had enough, and it was clear the city was tearing itself apart. But beneath the chaos, something far more dangerous was brewing. As Marcus recovered, McAllister introduced him to a group of underground operatives who had been watching the situation in Brookdale for months. Among them was Lexi Moore, a former journalist turned whistleblower. Lexi had uncovered the first hints of Calloway's network years ago, but had been silenced by threats and violence. Now she was determined to expose the truth. "I've been tracking Calloway for years," Lexi said during their first meeting, her voice tense with conviction. "He's been orchestrating these race wars across multiple cities, using corrupt cops like Rourke to incite violence and create division. It's all part of a bigger plan to destabilize communities and profit from the chaos." Marcus listened, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about stopping a machine that had been grinding away at the very fabric of society. "What's the end game?" Marcus asked, trying to wrap his head around it all. Lexi glanced at McAllister before answering. "Power. Control. By keeping people divided, they ensure that the system stays in their hands. They control the narrative, the politics, the law enforcement. And anyone who tries to stand against them disappears." Marcus clenched his fists. He had already seen what they were capable of. Now, it was time to hit them where it hurt. Meanwhile, Officer Clayton Rourke was in over his head. The media frenzy surrounding Marcus's wrongful arrest had put him in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. His superiors were distancing themselves, and internal investigations were digging into his past. Every dirty deal, every racial profiling incident he had been a part of was coming back to haunt him. But Rourke wasn't the type to go down quietly. He knew too much, and there were people in high places who owed him favors. He still had a few cards to play. One night, after downing more whiskey than he should have, Rourke met with his old friend, Lieutenant Paul Kinsey. Kinsey had always been one of Rourke's strongest allies on the force, and Rourke needed to know where Kinsey stood. "They're hanging me out to dry," Rourke spat as he slammed his glass on the bar. "You know damn well I was just doing my job." Kinsey nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Things are changing, Rourke. The higher-ups want someone to take the fall, and right now that someone is you." Rourke sneered, gripping his glass tighter. "I'm not going down without a fight. I've got dirt on them, enough to bring the whole damn department down." Kinsey's eyes flickered with something. Was it fear or calculation? "Be careful," Kinsey warned. "You don't want to make enemies out of the wrong people." But Rourke was done playing nice. He had nothing left to lose. Sarah Jenkins wasn't sleeping well. The betrayal of Marcus weighed on her heavily, but she had made her choice. In her mind, it was the only way to survive. Calloway had promised her protection, and she believed he could deliver. But the cost of her betrayal was becoming clearer with each passing day. She had thought Marcus would die that night in the warehouse, but rumors were spreading. Rumors that he was alive and plotting his revenge. It kept her up at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a fatal mistake. One evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the message sent chills down her spine. "Sarah, we need to meet," the voice said. It was Calloway. "Marcus is alive, and he's coming for us." With his new allies, Marcus began piecing together a plan. He knew he couldn't take down Calloway and his network all at once, but he could expose key players and disrupt their operations. The first target was Rourke. Through Lexi's connections, they discovered that Rourke had been quietly meeting with other corrupt officers in a desperate attempt to save his career. But Rourke was also sitting on a treasure trove of evidence, files and recordings that detailed his involvement with Calloway's network. If Marcus could get his hands on that evidence, he could blow the entire operation wide open. The plan was simple: break into Rourke's home, retrieve the evidence, and leak it to the press. But nothing in Brookdale was ever simple. Rourke had always been paranoid, but now that paranoia was justified. His home had become a fortress, with security cameras, reinforced locks, and a gun always within reach. He knew someone was coming for him. He just didn't know who. Marcus, Lexi, and McAllister prepared for the mission, going over every detail. But the clock was ticking. With each passing day, Rourke grew more desperate and more dangerous. The night of the break-in, the city was eerily quiet. The riots had died down, but tension still hung in the air. Marcus led the way, his heart pounding as they approached Rourke's house. They had one shot at this, and failure wasn't an option. But as they breached the perimeter, things went sideways. A silent alarm had been triggered, and within minutes, the house was swarming with officers. Marcus and his team barely made it out alive, and worse, they hadn't found the evidence. Back at the safe house, tensions ran high. Lexi slammed her fist on the table, frustration written across her face. "We're running out of time. If we don't get that evidence soon, everything we've worked for will be lost." Marcus knew she was right. But as the pieces of the puzzle continued to shift, one thing became clear. Rourke wasn't the only one holding the key to bringing down Calloway. Officer Clayton Rourke hadn't slept in days. Paranoia had sunk its claws deep into him, clawing away at his sanity. He had gone from swaggering through the streets of Brookdale untouchable to locking himself inside his crumbling suburban home, haunted by the knowledge that his time was running out. The police department was distancing themselves from him, denying they had ever condoned his actions. Internal investigations were quietly stacking evidence against him, but none of that scared him as much as the man he knew was out there, waiting: Marcus Hayes. Rourke had underestimated Hayes from the start, treating him like just another black man on the wrong side of Brookdale's law. But Hayes had proven to be a different kind of enemy, ruthless, methodical, and relentless in his pursuit of justice. Hayes had been digging, peeling back the layers of corruption that Rourke had helped build, and Rourke knew that he was running out of places to hide. The files Rourke had compiled over the years, blackmail, incriminating evidence, even recordings of conversations he'd had with corrupt officials, had once been his insurance policy. But now, they were his greatest liability. He had tried to leverage them for protection, contacting everyone from dirty cops to city officials, but no one wanted to be associated with him. He was a sinking ship, and they were jumping overboard. Rourke took another swig from the whiskey bottle on the table. His living room was in shambles, clothes strewn everywhere, old takeout containers piling up on the floor. The shades were drawn, leaving the room in perpetual darkness, save for the faint glow of a television screen showing an old police procedural. It was a bitter reminder of the career he was about to lose, the power he once wielded over people's lives. He had spent the last few nights pacing his house, checking the security cameras he'd hastily installed around the perimeter. His gun was never far from reach, lying on the coffee table next to him as he slept fitfully on the couch. Each creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement on the grainy camera footage set his nerves on edge. But Marcus hadn't come. Not yet. And the waiting was driving Rourke mad. While Rourke spiraled further into paranoia, Marcus Hayes was preparing. He had spent weeks tracking Rourke, knowing that the man would eventually make a desperate move. Marcus had already seen Rourke's world unraveling from the inside out. The media had painted him as the villain. The public protests outside Brookdale PD had forced the department to put him on unpaid leave, and even his closest allies in the precinct were avoiding him like the plague. Rourke was a man cornered, and that made him dangerous. But Marcus wasn't going in blind. He had help. Lexi Moore, the whistleblower journalist who had been digging into Rourke's past long before Marcus came onto the scene, had uncovered a crucial lead. Rourke had been in contact with an old associate, Lieutenant Paul Kinsey, trying to arrange a deal to sell the files and flee Brookdale before Marcus could catch up to him. Kinsey had refused to meet in person, likely sensing how toxic Rourke had become, but Marcus knew that Rourke was running out of options. Desperation would force him to act, and when that happened, Marcus would be ready. Through McAllister's network, Marcus had managed to plant a tracker on Rourke's car, giving him the ability to monitor Rourke's every move. It wasn't long before the erratic driving patterns, late-night rendezvous, and cryptic phone calls tipped Marcus off to where Rourke had stashed the files. Rourke had been sloppy. In his desperation, he had rented a storage unit on the outskirts of Brookdale under a fake name, believing it was far enough off the grid to avoid detection. But Lexi had already intercepted several encrypted communications between Rourke and Kinsey about the files, and Marcus had everything he needed. It was time to move. The night was thick with humidity as Marcus crouched behind a row of parked cars, watching the storage facility from a distance. Lexi was in a surveillance van nearby, monitoring the security cameras. McAllister stood next to Marcus, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip. They had planned this meticulously. There was no room for error. "Rourke's been holed up in there for over an hour." Lexi's voice crackled through the earpiece. He's probably trying to make contact with Kinsey again, but Kinsey's not taking his calls. Marcus nodded. This is his last play. He's got no one left. McAllister grunted in agreement. Just be careful. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. The plan was simple. Get in, retrieve the files, and corner Rourke before he could destroy them, or make a run for it. Marcus wasn't interested in a firefight. He wanted the files, the evidence that could bring Calloway's entire operation crashing down. As they approached the storage unit, Marcus's heart pounded. The door was slightly ajar, the faint light from inside spilling onto the gravel parking lot. He motioned for McAllister to take the rear entrance while he moved silently toward the front. Inside, Rourke was hunched over a stack of papers, muttering to himself. The flickering fluorescent light above him cast deep shadows across his face, making him look gaunt, hollowed out. His hands trembled as he flipped through the files, his eyes darting to his phone every few seconds, hoping for a message from Kinsey that wasn't coming. Marcus watched from the doorway, his mind racing. He had never seen Rourke like this, so broken, so utterly defeated. This was no longer the arrogant, racist cop who had arrested him with a smirk on his face. This was a man who had lost everything, clinging to the last shred of power he had left. Rourke suddenly froze, his body tensing as if sensing Marcus's presence. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun on the table. "Don't," Marcus said, his voice low but firm as he stepped into the light, his own weapon drawn and aimed at Rourke's chest. "It's over." Rourke's eyes widened as he turned to face Marcus, his expression shifting from fear to fury. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine? This isn't yours," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "It never was." Rourke's lip curled into a sneer as he stood, his hand still resting on his gun. "You self-righteous bastard. You think you're any better than me? You think you're going to save this city?" "I'm not here to save it," Marcus said. "I'm here to make sure people like you can't tear it apart anymore." Rourke laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You're a pawn, just like the rest of us. Calloway's been playing this game a lot longer than you have, and he's got pieces on the board you can't even see." Marcus's grip on his gun tightened. "Then I'll keep playing, and I'll take him down, one piece at a time, starting with you." Rourke's hand twitched toward his gun, but before he could draw it, Marcus stepped forward, slamming him against the table. The files scattered across the floor as Marcus pinned Rourke down, the gun falling from his grasp and clattering to the ground. Rourke struggled, but he was no match for Marcus's strength. "You can't stop this," Rourke growled through gritted teeth. "They'll just replace me. There's always another one of us ready to step in." "Not if I burn the whole system down," Marcus replied, his voice ice cold. With a final shove, Marcus slammed Rourke's head against the table, knocking him out cold. The fight was over. As Rourke lay unconscious on the floor, Marcus quickly gathered the files, his hands shaking with adrenaline. There were thousands of documents, bank transfers, recorded conversations, photographs. This was everything he needed, not just to take down Rourke, but to expose Calloway's entire network. McAllister appeared at the entrance, his gun still drawn, scanning the room. "You good?" Marcus nodded, holding up the stack of files. "I've got it. This is it." But McAllister's eyes narrowed as he noticed something behind Marcus. "Then we've got to go. Now." Marcus turned to see Rourke stirring, his eyes fluttering open. But it wasn't Rourke that had McAllister on edge. It was the sound of sirens in the distance. Rourke had triggered an alarm, and Brookdale PD was on its way. "Let's move," McAllister barked, pulling Marcus toward the door. "We've got what we need. No time to waste." As they made their way out of the storage facility, Marcus glanced back at Rourke one last time. The man lay crumpled on the floor, broken in every sense of the word. But Marcus felt no sympathy. Rourke had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. With the files in hand, Marcus and his allies began leaking the information to the press. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to expose the full extent of the corruption. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted across the country, politicians were forced to resign, and the FBI was under intense scrutiny. But as the chaos unfolded, Calloway remained one step ahead, disappearing into the shadows before anyone could catch him. Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. Calloway was still out there, still pulling strings, and as long as he was free, the war for Brookdale's soul would continue. As the dust settled, Marcus found himself standing on the steps of Brookdale's City Hall, watching as the city tried to rebuild itself. But the scars ran deep, and the fight was far from over. McAllister joined him, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You did good, Hayes, but you know this isn't the end." Marcus nodded. "I know. Calloway's still out there." McAllister blew out a puff of smoke. "You gonna go after him?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the city he had fought so hard to protect. "This isn't over," he said finally, "not by a long shot." As Marcus walked away from City Hall, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lexi. "We found him." Marcus's heart raced as he read the message. Calloway had resurfaced, and this time there would be no escape. With one last glance at the city behind him, Marcus turned and began walking toward the future. The hunt for Calloway had only just begun. Stay tuned for the episode 3 of this intriguing story coming soon on this channel. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more interesting and captivating racial discrimination stories.